Why are churches tax exempt? Periodically we hear calls for the elimination of all tax exempt status because we are told it constitutes a public subsidy of groups which have this status. Our concern is with how this impacts the church. Often these suggestions are directed specifically at churches. Occasionally we even hear such talk within the church. This betrays some very faulty theology, because it involves a real lack of comprehension of the lordship of Jesus Christ. What is the presupposition of such talk which suggests the removal of tax exemption from the church? It begins with the assumption that the state is the primary and supervising institution of society and has a right to tax versus the church's privilege of tax exemption. It assumes the subservience of the church to the state. Tax exemption, such reasoning says, is a gift, a grace of the state that can be withdrawn at its will. This is not the origin of the church's tax exemption. The church has been tax exempt for many centuries. It was recognized as a separate realm by the later Byzantine and early European emperors. This is a remarkable fact, considering their often elevated opinion of their own authority. The Christians believed the church and its property was the dominion of its king, Jesus, the Lord of all earthly lords. The history of Western civilization has been within the context of this right which few monarchs have ever dared to challenge. The IRS, incidentally, says on its website that churches are by nature tax exempt and do not have to apply for tax exemption. The churches very early claimed freedom from taxation as their right, not a privilege. The church demanded the state recognize this fact and never acknowledged it was a grant given to it by the state. The question is one of authority. And another way of saying that is to say it's a question of lordship. Obviously, God is God, and Jesus is Lord to whom all power in heaven and earth was given. In that sense, God is Lord over all, church and state included. But we must not assume that because God is Lord, His church has unlimited authority. The fact that God is Lord means all life is in terms of that lordship. That means that the church has very real authority and right, but only within a godly context. It means the state has very real authority and responsibility, but only within godly limits. We could say the same of the family, the school, the workplace, and more. All human authority is limited. The assumption, then, that the church receives a privilege in tax exemption betrays both a lack of a knowledge of history and a compromised theology, one that says the church is ultimately responsible to the state for its use of funds and property. If this were the case, then the state could make rules for the church and seize church property if it deemed it in the state's or the public's interest. The state is not the legitimate custodian of church property, nor is it the legitimate custodian of all other property. It is a statist and socialistic mindset that presume the state is the ultimate custodian of all goods. A church cannot accept this supposition, or it becomes not a church of Jesus Christ, but a state church. The purpose of the ancient recognition of tax exemption and the more recent First Amendment to the Constitution was to recognize the uniqueness of the church and to preserve the church from the state. Neither tax exemption nor the freedom of the church were privileges given to the church. Though our laws in recent years have expanded tax exemption to other religions, charitable and nonprofit groups, these have piggybacked on an ancient status that belongs by right to the Church of Jesus Christ. To give up this right would be to give to Caesar the things that are God's and to lose a millennium and a half of legal protection. The church has tax exemption because it is another kingdom, another jurisdiction, and the Lord and King of that dominion does not allow usurpers and outsiders to collect taxes within that kingdom. Remember, privileges are granted, but rights are recognized. The tax exemption of the church is not a privilege granted by the state, but a right of the church recognized by the state.